Let me see if we have it. Yes, it started. Ok. Sejam muito bem-vindos ao podcast Logofonia. Nesse episódio do PET Entrevista, vamos entrevistar Jonathan Okeke Chimakonam. So I'm going to start this interview in English. I was just presenting to everyone our interview space here at Logofonia. And I'll start presenting guests. Jonathan Okeke Chimakonam was born in 1983. In 2001, he enrolled to study philosophy at Ebonyi State University, located in Abakaliki, the capital of Ebonyi State in eastern Nigeria. Upon graduating in 2005, Chimakonam carried out his national youth service in Ondo State in western Nigeria. After his national service, he proceeded to the University of Calabar, where he completed his master's and doctorate in the field of logic. As a postgrad student, Chimakonam taught philosophy and logic at the Center for General Studies at the University of Calabar between 2008 and 2013. In 2013, he got permanent position at the Department of Philosophy at University of Calabar. In 2016, he became a senior lecturer, and in 2018, he joined the University of Pretoria as a senior lecturer. Currently, Chimakonam is associate professor at the University of Pretoria. Jonathan Chimakonam is also the president of the Conversational Society of Philosophy. He is a logician, social thinker, and public intellectual, and has authored and co-authored, edited and co-edited over 140 research works. Thank you so much for giving us this interview, Dr. Chimakonam.
Thank you very much. I am pleased to be here as well.
Well, I'd like to start this interview by asking you to tell us a little bit about your trajectory in academic philosophy. What motivated you to pursue the study of African philosophy?
Okay, thank you. That's an interesting question. When I finished my first encounter with African philosophy was during my undergraduate studies at Ebonyi State University under the influence of Dr. Michael Okoro. But I wouldn't say that I was enamored by the subject at that time. And I was really so keen at studying logic. And so I proceeded to the University of Calabar to study logic under Professors Dugimen and Ijoma for my master's and doctorates. And the very first rounds of academic talks that I gave afterwards were all on logic. But I discovered something as I was giving conference talks in those days. I discovered that not too many people attended my talks on logic. That was quite discouraging. And eventually, my research was taking me into what some other African logicians had done. And that was when I struck a gold mine that I could actually use my knowledge of logic to wade into African philosophy fully, which as at that time I had been, doing really not with so much vigor and seriousness. And that was what inspired me to start deepening research into African philosophy using my knowledge of logic. So it was really something that was not so, it wasn't a great experience that drove me fully into African philosophy. It was the experience of people not being so keen at listening to my talks whenever I attended conferences to give a talk on logic. that made me to think of what people might be interested in and what I would also be interested in doing. And discovering that I could use my knowledge of logic in African philosophy, that was a great something that excited me so much. And that was how I delved into African philosophy, and I've never looked back. Thank you.
Oh, that's awesome. And since you found this space in academia to work with logic and African philosophy, what challenges do you face in academia, in African academia, as a scholar interested in African philosophical thought?
Okay, so two main challenges really. One is that most of the African logicians that are my contemporaries are really not so much interested in African philosophy. Those who are serious in African philosophy are not logicians. And so the contribution that I bring into African philosophy, even though there are quite many young generations discussing my work in African philosophy, my contributions are, you can say that not too many of my contemporaries really are engaging, okay, in a robust way with my contribution, since much of it have a direct bearing on logic. And since they are not logicians, some of them find it difficult to engage. And the importance of any academic endeavor or any academic contribution lies in the fact that other scholars and other colleagues engage with whatever you have contributed, because that's the only way knowledge grows. So that's the main challenge really that I experience in the field. But there is bright light in the horizon, because there are quite a number of young academics who have interest in logic and interest in African philosophy, and they are finding my contribution to be groundbreaking as far as the field is concerned. Thank you.
That's nice. That's a good answer. Thank you. And I was reading your biography written by Lindo Kusle Shabani, and he wrote about how you describe this cockiness in academic spaces, this healthy arrogance that young scholars, especially those interested in marginalized epistemologies, should sometimes adopt in order to survive this hostile space. How does that help us, that healthy arrogance, how does it help us to do more work around those margins?
That's a very interesting one. And especially that it caught the eye of Lindo Kunle, and now has caught your eye as well. That's entirely my own thinking and my own mindset towards an academic environment that is so hostile to non-Western philosophies, right? And that is outside of African continent, and within African continent, that is also hostile to young and upcoming scholars who have got something, who want to stray from the acceptable path of doing whatever, as far as African philosophy is concerned. So there are two main lines of opposition, the one coming from the West, pushing back against the development and growth of African philosophy. Number two, the one coming from within African philosophy, where some elders, some older people see themselves as, cast themselves in the role of the traditional African elder, who must preside over everything and dictate how everything must go. So as a young academic a decade ago, coming up and bringing logic to bear in my study of African philosophy, I strayed out of the path that they were comfortable with. And that attracted a lot of opposition and pushback. So what do you do as a young scholar when you find yourself between the devil and the deep blue, trying to suppress and pressure you down? You just have to remain focused on what you believe is the correct thing, and disregarding side attractions, persevering. Some are going to accuse you of being arrogant. Some are going to think you're cocky and all that. Well, accept all those things and all the positive implications they carry with them, and forge ahead, believing that at some point history will vindicate you. And so, as it vindicated me, and writing about it in my book was also to give encouragement to those, the young people who will be trailblazers of tomorrow as far as African scholarship is concerned, not to be deterred or dismayed by such oppositions, but to trudge ahead, believe strongly in what they're doing, and give it the full measure of their strength. Yes, so it is a positive thing that works where there are all kinds of negative energies designed to push one down and restrict progress and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thinking more about the process of producing the book, writing the book, Ezumezu, I was very curious while reading it, wondering if there was any philological or etymological work behind it, because there's so many words from different languages, from Igbo, from Latin, think with words more than anything else. And so I ask you, did Ezumezu demand any archaeological, philological, or etymological research work?
Yes, but philological, not archaeological. I am not an archaeologist and I have no experience in archaeology, but philological. And, yes, there were portions of the research that compelled me to study languages, some literature, and all kinds of things to be able to come up with the right terms and words to be used in some of the concepts that I framed along the way. And like you said, that you encountered words and concepts from different languages, especially the Igbo language, which is my language. Perhaps the reason might suffice why I framed many of my concepts in the Igbo language. If I had my way, I would have written Ezumezu in Igbo language or any other African language. But then that would have drastically reduced the audience for the book. You would never have known about the book if I had written it in Igbo language. And because, and that was, has a positive and negative side. Positive in the sense that when we write in one of these colonial languages, then we stand the chance of getting the work available to wider academic audience around the world. But the negative is that having to choose to write in a foreign language negates and ultimately stifles the growth of local African languages. Okay? So what do I have to do, having found myself in this type of dilemma? I decided that even though I was going to go ahead to write in a foreign language, in English, which I consider a colonial language, I would frame my concepts, most of my concepts in Igbo language, which is an African language. In this way, because philosophy deals with concepts, and I frame most of my concepts in Igbo language, then the ideas that I wish to communicate would have to be communicated through the concepts that I framed in Igbo language, even though I may go ahead to explain such concepts in English. So for me, using framing a lot of concepts in Igbo language in Ezumezu was a form of intellectual rebellion. I was rebelling against the foreign language that's been imposed on me and the circumstances that made it difficult for me to write in my language, for me to choose to write in a foreign language. So that for me was an act of rebellion, an intellectual rebellion, one that also allows me to achieve some advantage in terms of using my language here and there. Thank you.
That's interesting because you pose a relation between the work of the non-Western philosopher with Western tools or Western concepts, or a dialogue that needs to be established between the Western cosmos, let's just say. So in the beginning of the book, you trace an interesting parallel between the postmodernist philosophical approach and your own project in Ezumezu. Uh, in what sense postmodernism approximates and differs from the philosophical project that you pose in Ezumezu?
Okay, thank you very much. In an interesting work that Paul Fairbairn wrote, published in 1975, if I'm not mistaken, titled Against Method, which was a postmodernist work, he advocated not only the existence of various methods in research, but the acknowledgement that these methods have cultural underpinnings, and that allowing these methods to flourish and tapping from the advantages which every method affords us is something that can lead to growth of knowledge far beyond what we know as at that time. In 1979, a French philosopher called Jean-François Lyotard published another book that he titled The Postmodern Condition. And in that book, he defines postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narratives, all right? So doubting the absolute nature of the so-called orthodoxies or models of knowledge is a postmodern orientation. Now, Ezumezu for me is cast in that light as well. We are in a world where even the English dictionary is yet to recognize that logic will be used in plural by logics. It's always in the singular, logic. Okay? And because everyone agrees that logic agglutinates principles of intelligibility, and all of us are rational human beings, then they tend to conclude quite in a haste that what we have is one single mode of logic. Okay? Now, logic might agglutinate principles of intelligibility, but there are different approaches to studying logic. Okay? It doesn't mean that some of us are rational and some are irrational, as some misguided Western anthropologists, sociologists, and philosophers would claim, the likes of the French scholar Lucien Levy-Bruhl, the author of Primitive Mentality, the English scholar, some English scholar and German scholars like Hegel and Kant, and even Robin Houghton quite recently. These people were wrong in thinking that any other form of logic is impossible besides the strand of logic that originated with Aristotle and achieved its exponential development in modern time in the works of the German logician Frege, the British logicians Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, and a host of other logicians after them. Okay, so it's in the spirit of postmodern thinking that Ezumezu comes in to demonstrate that an order logic is not only possible, but actually exists. It behooves on us to develop and formalize it. There are people who have been, besides reasoning in the traditional ways that align with the three basic laws of thoughts, there are also other forms of inferences that the three laws of thought cannot adequately axiomatize, okay, and which are all part of human reasoning procedures. And I am talking of complementary inferences, relational inferences, and even inferences that we find in quantum mechanics of these days. So Ezumezu is postmodern in the sense that it tries to demonstrate that incredulity towards an established system that affirms the existence of one mode of logic. Right? Thank you.
So in this sense, you will also debate on the approximations. Would there be anything that European postmodernism, like French postmodernism, does that doesn't do actually that Ezumezu can do? I mean, in the sense of how it differs from the postmodernism we find in France, for example, or in Anglo-Saxon countries in Europe and the United States, for example.
Okay, so one remarkable difference is that Ezumezu represents an attempt to take postmodern advocacy, an intellectual resistance to the field of logic. And this is something very important and significant because logic is not just another field. Logic is part of the human intellectual set of principles that lie at the foundation of thought. Okay? And that is why it is regarded as instrument of reasoning, instrument of thought, in its entirety. In all fields of learning, there is logic underlying whatever people do there. And people have taken postmodernism to the arts, they've taken postmodernism to the languages, they've done so to different sciences. Okay, Ezumezu represents an incursion into the foundation of thinking, foundation of scholarship and thought itself, which makes it this postmodern attempt a very remarkable one. However, it shares in common the orientation that other postmodernists around the world and in different fields have, which is to challenge the spurious claims that there's only one way of doing something, that there's only one standard, there are only one set of norms and laws that define what is acceptable and distinguishes from that which is unacceptable in a particular field. Okay? And so that is what makes the postmodern quest important, and Ezumezu as a logical representation of postmodern advocacy remarkable. Thank you.
So in that sense, Ezumezu discusses a lot of concepts such as relativism, relativity, universalism, universalization, absolutism in some sense. How can these notions help us to settle the African logic problematic surrounding relative and universal debate?
Okay, so the question of universalism and relativism these issues are not peculiar to the African logic debate. These are issues that have peppered scholarship for generations, right? And those who ascribe to the modern incarnation of Aristotle in scholarship, and especially the Enlightenment scholars, Immanuel Kant and the rest of them, that try to establish one all-encompassing standard for scholarship and thought, okay, would always try to draw a line between what is universal and the rest that are relative. And that which is relative is discarded as regional, contextual, culture bound, and all kinds of pejorative concepts that I used to describe that, while at the same time eulogizing that which they claim to be universal to be contextual. Okay, their idea is that what is universal is something that applies to all human beings in different parts of the world at all times and what have you. And for them, the universal is what has the merit or the stamp of objectivity and credibility. Okay, the relative does not, because it is a local application of things and principles that may not apply in other places or universally. Now, the reimagination of these concepts within the African logic debate, which again I sought to clarify in the book Ezumezu, was actually geared towards pointing out a fundamental error that exists, that is at the foundation of modern thought itself. Okay, so that led me to clarify between what is distinguish relativism from relativity. All right, a principle could be culturally, locally applicable and universally applicable at the same time. That which is universal applies somewhere, and the contextual manifestation or application of that which is universal is a form of relative imagination of that very idea. Okay, so it would be wrong to dismiss anything that applies to a local context, any principle of law that applies to a local concept as culture bound and philosophical. All right, and that was why I had to distinguish between relativism, that which is properly culture bound and cannot apply elsewhere outside that culture, and relativity, that which can apply in local specific culture areas or contexts and at the same time apply universally. And the inspiration for this comes from the letter that M. Césaire de Martinique wrote to the president of the French Communist Party in 1956. His resignation letter, actually. In that letter, he accused the French Communist Party of trying to impose the Western cultural view on everyone, claiming it to be universal, whereas it's actually a Western cultural perspective. Every knowledge derived from a certain cultural worldview. The elevation of that knowledge to the level of universal is only a testament that such a knowledge can apply in other places as well. But there is no knowledge that should be elevated to the level of the absolute or as an absolute instance, which the idea of universality that is bandied around often assumes. That which is taken to be universal is presented as if it is absolute, an absolute instance of itself. That's incorrect. And in order to distinguish these concepts, clarify this, and show the error implicit in Western scholarship and modernity itself, I had to dedicate an ample passages in a chapter to this. So thank you.
And in that sense, I think it connects with another discussion you mentioned in the book. You mentioned two tendencies when discussing the justification of studying African philosophy in the first place. So first you mentioned a West committed African philosophy and then ethno-philosophers. So in your view, what are the demerits of these two positions within the African philosophy debate?
Okay, so in the last century, a host of African philosophers and scholars returned to the continent, having studied in France and in North America, in Europe. They returned to the continent and started propagating a certain brand of philosophy. As at the time, the debate, as at the time, some other philosophers began to, some of them self-styled, self-trained, others trained in Europe but came back with a different mindset, others trained on the continent. They started contemplating and publishing treatises that are eminently philosophical, and some christened some of their works African philosophy. So the other contingent that returned started criticizing them and saying that using the standard of philosophy they learned in Europe to criticize what these other people were doing at home. And finding what these people were doing at home not to align with what they had been taught in Europe, they dismissed what was being done at home as ethno-philosophical. Okay? The concept ethno-philosophy was actually coined by the Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Nkrumah when he was doing his PhD at Lincoln University in the USA. But this concept, and he never intended it to have any negative meanings. However, in the late 70s, a Benin philosopher, Pauline Hotonji, re-exhumed this concept and gave it a very negative connotation, using it as it were to describe the works of those Africans who eventually were categorized as traditionalists or particularists, African philosophers. He christened them ethno-philosophers to dismiss what they were doing as localized, culture-bound, and without a universal pedigree. However, by the time the debate wound up, it turned out that those who had christened themselves professional philosophers or the universalists, so to speak, were actually shooting themselves in the foot. These people had been tutored in Europe, and they've been unable to shake off the tutelage. They came home with that tutelage, and they tried to compel the African philosophy practiced by people to align with European philosophy. If that happens, then how would you be able to distinguish African philosophy from European philosophy or Western philosophy? All right? But again, some of those who were doing what was Christian ethno-philosophy were again not fine-tuning their analysis, their argumentations, and their rigor to the highest levels possible. Okay? It must be acknowledged that some of them degraded to the point of doing descriptive works, that when you consider the merit of those works, you begin to wonder, how do you then distinguish what they are doing from what the sociologists or the anthropologists are doing? All you see are descriptive work that try to present the life world of traditional Africa. Again, that for me does not pass muster as what African philosophy should be. But that is not to say that all of the things that those who were grouped into ethno-philosophy were doing were ethno-philosophical or were culture-bound. So they were wrong, the universalists who criticized them as such. And so what I did was to clarify these points and show that the universalists were wrong eminently. And a number of people who were categorized as ethno-philosophers were actually not doing rigorous African philosophy. and to again demonstrate that every logic, every philosophical tradition can be distinguished from another through the logic and methodologies and ontology that lie at the foundation of that philosophical tradition. It is on these notes that my research took me into defining and demarcating clearly the foundations of African philosophy, grounding it on a trivalent logic, on a three-value logic, and a trivalent ontology, and methodologies that were mapped out from these foundations. Thank you.
So in that sense, also I reading the book, one of my favorite chapters in Ezumezu is the one about the schools of thought in African philosophy. You seem to establish a historical yet also a critical panoramic view on the main positions in African philosophy debate. I find your analysis of the apologists especially interesting. Could you comment more on the ways apologists like Leopold Senghor hit and miss the spot while defending the possibility of African thought? So could you elaborate more on the apologist side of the quest?
Okay, so various schools of thought in African logic. This follows a trail of debates that was going on at the same time that the debate on the existence of African philosophy was ongoing. But the debate on African logic was much more unrecognized at the time. In 1958, the Cameroonian philosopher and logician Menrad Hebgar published an article he titled Logic in Africa. In that article, he tried to provide the first basic assumptions that the laws and principles of Western logic do not exhaust all parameters of reasoning available to human beings, and that African logicians can contribute from that perspective. In his works in 1960s, the Senegalese statesman and philosopher Leopold Senghor tried to advance and put these assumptions by Hebgar into practice. And he was able to distinguish between reasoning in the West, and in Africa. And the one he called rational and not the other he called affective. People misunderstood him. He came back to clarify himself, but nobody was interested in reading the piece of article where he clarified himself. And from then onwards, the idea of African logic attracted some form of disdain up until and in the 1960s, after Senghor, some other European scholars like Robin Houghton published 2 treatises where he really describes what could be called African logic as superstitious, logic of supernaturalism, something. It's a disdainful appellation for that matter. But then by 1980s, some Nigerian philosophers and logicians like Joseph Amoregbe, 1985, as well as C.S. Momo, 1989, began to think seriously about contributions from African perspective to logic that will bring in what was missing in the Western constructed logic and the history of logic itself. In fact, it was C.S. Momo himself who popularly threw down what he called the gauntlet to young and upcoming African logicians to pick up and develop the principles that can accommodate some form of inferences that we know very well we use that cannot be accommodated in Western history of logic. And so the debates continued. They took Huduma and Akim Makinde and the rest of them, some of them animadversions, some of them proponents, to the point that the Calabar School stepped in. Innocent Asuzu and Chrissy Joma tried to demonstrate, build systems of African logic to demonstrate that. And I stood on their shoulders to develop the system of Ezumezu, which I consider much more complete than other systems before it. And so the apologists are those who just want to establish and demonstrate the existence of African logic at all costs. Okay, ignoring, as it were, what you stand as a basic standard of scholarship in the field. So it doesn't matter to them that they would violate a lot of rules insofar as they accomplish what they wish to accomplish. And there are many of such scholars, and most of them, I believe, are reactionaries, wounded by the history of colonialism, slavery, and the intellectual humiliations that Africans have suffered around the world and continue to suffer today. So they get ahead of themselves, get overwhelmed, and miss the point, all right? And they cast Senghor as their saint, ignorant of the fact that Senghor had clarified himself and resisted and refused the corner of the corner where he is placed. But it's a big and burgeoning school in African logic, which I demonstrated when I talked about the system builders, that we could do much more better than that. Thank you.
And while you discuss the criterion to define a discourse as African or not, you adopt the logic-based criterion, which you mentioned before. So I would like you to elaborate on what this criterion consists and why is it more accurate to select which discourses belong to African philosophies and which do not.
Okay, thank you very much. If you survey the history of philosophy and you pick up any textbook in the history of philosophy, no textbook tells you why Western philosophy is Western philosophy. All right? Nowadays, you can find textbooks that talk about Western philosophy and acknowledge Asian philosophies and all kinds of philosophies, even African philosophy. But very few, you would have to really traverse a huge forest of books before you see any passage where any scholar is trying to tell you what distinguishes one philosophical tradition from another. And so I found myself in that position and realized that part of what we must do as Africans who want to place our philosophy in the global map is to pick up the responsibility of demonstrating what makes a philosophical tradition unique in itself and different from other philosophical traditions. And so I surveyed the literature and came to my own conclusion. My conclusion was that in field of thought, the thoughts, it's like a pyramid. The system of thought is like a pyramid, okay? The pyramid divided into 3 chambers. At the bottom of that chamber, you have logic. Logic dealing with the laws that govern reasoning. By the side of logic, you have ontology. Ontology dealing with realities that are involved in that reasoning process. Because every reasoning is reasoning about something. And ontology is what deals with realities. So logic and ontology comfortably sit at the foundation of thought, at the foundation of any system whatsoever. Now, on top of that chamber is the second chamber that I label methods. All right? Every inquiry, every research, every quest to know follows a certain method or some methods. Okay? And methods deal with different ways of applying the laws of logic that lies at the foundational component of that pyramid. And then on top of that second chamber is the third chamber, the pinnacle of that pyramid. And in this pinnacle, I find principles, concepts, theories, and what have you. And I describe these as various ways of organizing ideas along the line of different or specific methods that lie at the second chamber. Now, this is the structure of a typical system that you'll find anywhere at all in any field whatsoever. Now, how does this enable us to distinguish philosophical traditions? That takes us to logic. Now, if, as we understand it, the three basic principles that govern thought in Western tradition are identity, contradiction, and excluded middle. Now, that yields basically two-valued logic. And there are people whose reasoning exceed or transcend the two-valued logic parameters. Like in Africa, for example, the type of logic that properly covers reason here will be three-valued of the truth cloth type. And that means that ontology, that the African ontology would be dealing with a trivalent mapping of reality rather than a bivalent mapping of reality. Okay, it means that reasoning here would go beyond. In the West, you have the basic thesis of bivalence and determinism. In Africa, you will have to transcend that to trivalence and complementarism, as the case may be. It doesn't mean that African logic abhors the principles of Western logic. No, because logic brings together principles of intelligibility. If you toss an apple up here, okay, in South Africa, it will fall down. If you do so where you are in Brazil, it will fall down too. If you do that in London, it will fall down. New York, the same thing. If you want to cross the road in New York, you will look left and right. If I want to do so here in Stellenbosch, South Africa, I will have to look left and right as well. That's two-value logic. That's excluded middle. That's law of common contradiction, as the case may be. So these principles also apply in Africa here. In Africa, in our reasoning, it does apply, but they are not adequate. So we have to weaken those laws to formulate three additional laws to cover various forms of inferences not accommodated in these laws in order for us to devise the type of logic that will be quite broad for, have adequate expressive powers to cover the reasonings not covered in Western logic. And so this is how we'll be able to distinguish Western philosophy from African philosophy. If someone has written a piece of article, and we have to ask ourselves, which logic has guided the reasoning in this article? What the methods, which logic do the methods use align to? Once you ask these two questions, then you know the leaning of that very work. Okay, and if you bring the theories in Western philosophy together, and then you see them fall in one group, and as such, you'll be able to distinguish the works in African philosophy or African philosophical tradition from the Western philosophical tradition. Thank you.
So since there's a rich methodological discussion in the book, since method, the question for method is so important, in your view, it is possible to separate methods from the philosophical content produced within them. I ask in a sense of separating, let's just say, matter of form. How much the method for African philosophy is imbricated with the contents of African philosophy themselves?
Okay, so it is not possible to separate method from the content that lies, if you remember, the pyramid that I tried to describe. Okay, insofar as it is just like you want to bake cake, all right? And you've got your flour, and you've got your milk, and you've got your butter, and the rest of them. And then you mix all of them together, all right? And then you bake your cake. And when you finish baking your cake, someone says, well, all right, why don't you separate the butter from the milk, from the flour, from the water in the cake? All right? It is the mixture of these ingredients that creates the cake. And that is also the case when you have created a theory. You have used a certain method, you've used methods, okay, and you've used concepts, you've used ideas, but it is the method that actually enables you to find your path to that end product you call a theory. Okay? Before you begin that inquiry, you'll be able to point out, okay, this is my method, and you'll be able to point out, okay, these are the ideas I have. But they're not a theory yet. They're not the principle yet. Okay? You've got to use the method, allow it to work its magic with ideas to form theories. All right? So in that case, these things are important to one another in order for ideas to grow. Thank you.
You mentioned before that we have to weaken the traditional laws of Western logic in order for us to have space to work with this new possibility of logic. So in Ezumezu, you introduce some principles and operators in the system of logic. And what I would like for you to elaborate, what are the three supplementary laws themselves, and why they are so important to constitute this typically African logic?
Okay, so the three supplementary laws, and they are called supplementary, to indicate that they are not replacing the three traditional laws. They supplement them. All right? And so these laws are Njikoka. You can translate it as integrativity. You have Mmekoka, you can translate, and anonymity. Mmekoka we can translate as relationality, and anonymity as complementarity. But these laws come from have a metaphysical foundation or roots. Okay? And perhaps I should start by explaining the metaphysical principles from which these laws are derived. These three basic metaphysical principles in African thought are relationality, contextuality, and complementarity. Relationality states that variables necessarily interrelate irrespective of their unique contexts, all things considered, because no variable is an ego solus. This principle is saying that every reality in existence necessarily interrelates with other realities, because it cannot stand on its own. I'll give you an example. Okay? My laptop is in front of me. Okay? And I believe perhaps your own computer is in front of you as well. Now, when you look at your computer, what do you see? You see intricate relationships. You see the metal panel, you see the plastic panel, you see the keyboards, you see the paintings, you see the glass, you see the screen, you see all kinds of things. If you break it up, you see all kinds of circuits there, and nuts and screws and what have you. Yet, these things signify intricate relationship between all those different parts of the laptop. Even as at that, the laptop is resting on a table, on a desk. The desk is made of wood, plastic, some coatings, some nails, some iron, and what have you. Again, intricate relationship between all kinds of things. Even the desk is resting on the floor. On the floor, you see tiles, you see cement, you see sand, all kinds of things. You see carpet. All right? Tell me anything that actually stands alone in this world. Absolutely nothing. So relationality as a basic principle in African thought says that everything necessarily interrelates, all things considered, because no variable is an ego solus. The second principle is contextuality. Now, coming from the first principle, this one says that every relationship, that relationship talked about in the first principle, between variables, that every relationship occurs in a specific context and can only be understood within that context because context obsesses facts. All right? Think of, for example, you see a young man and a young lady having lunch together and talking. An onlooker might look at how they are talking and say, okay, they are couples, these are husband and wife. Another might say, these are girlfriend and boyfriend. Another might say these are business partners. Another might say these are just colleagues. Someone might say these are just old friends that run into each other. Another might say these are just strangers that just happen to find comfort in their company, share lunch. There are all kinds of contexts that can define that relationship you're seeing there. Okay? But to be able to understand the relationship, what the nature of relationship between those two people are, you have to dig down to the context of that relationship. Only then will you be able to know for sure whether they are business partners or whether they are couples. Okay, and this is what happens in the relationship between all kinds of entities in the world. The third principle is complementarity. Okay, again, following from first and second states that seemingly opposed variables can have a relationship of complementation rather than mere contradiction. And this principle, again, tells us that we acknowledge that sometimes entities that are mutually opposed could be in a relationship. Okay, but just like the law of non-contradiction stipulates in the traditional laws of thought in the West, that such relationship will end in contradiction, binary opposition. This principle is suggesting that even mutual opposites could transcend binary opposition or contradiction to construct a relationship of complementarity. From these basic principles, I formulated the three supplementary laws in Njikoka. Njikoka, again, to tell us about relationship. Okay, and Mekoka, the second one, to talk about the context of such relationships. And Onanetiti, to again talk about the possibility of transcending contradiction to arrive at complementation as a superior form of relationship that variables pursue. You will be able to understand it by perhaps understanding the trajectory of the approach of philosophy of the Calabar school that I belong to, but I'll save that for another day, or perhaps if one of your questions leads us there. Thank you.
Thank you. So in that sense, you introduce an operator that's very curious during the book, the wedge implication. Since the wedge implication is heavily characterized in terms of context, could you elaborate on what is the wedge implication, and if the wedge implication seems to me personally as a semantically charged operator. So I would like you to comment if that is a point of view, a reasonable point of view. It seems to me that the wedge implication minimizes the distance between semantics and syntax in a formal level, let's just say, and also in an interesting interpretational way when it brings context to our analysis. Could you comment on this, please?
Exactly, you're correct. The wedge implication also functions both as notation for implication and as a context indicator. Okay, as a functor that serves the purpose of implication, it enables us to infer one possibility from another. Okay, as a context indicator, it takes us down to subject matter. It is a functor that enables us to move from logical form to subject matter, in an interesting way, without us even perhaps noticing it so obviously. So instead of the normal implication that enables us to conduct an inference that leads from one thing implying another in that linear fashion, we see ourselves with this wedged implication being able to conduct an inference not from A to B, but from A through B to C. Not from A to C, but from A through B to C, where B represents a context that A and C could come down to. So it is an interesting notation that we have there. Thank you.
In one of your previous answers, you mentioned the conversational philosophy. So I think it's a good time for us to ask you, what is conversational philosophy and how it helps us, together with Ezumezu, to ground some theories in African philosophy. In your book, you mentioned how Ezumezu, for example, can help us to think about theories such as Ubuntu and other iconic concepts we know from African philosophy. So how are these concepts and ideas linked together?
Okay, so ideologically, I belong to the Calabar School, aka the Conversational School, which is a school of thought that developed in the early 1990s at the University of Calabar, the coastal city of Calabar, bringing scholars and adjoining institutions in that eastern part of Nigeria together. And to answer this your question, by the 1990s, African philosophers agreed that the next step to take was to build systems of African philosophy. And people like Innocent Assos, Panteleon Irebu, Chris Ijoma, Godfrey Zumba, and the rest of them, Andrew Dukumen, started contributing from that direction in what would later become the Calabar School and then the Conversational School. Now, what is the approach to African philosophy or to philosophy generally of the Conversational School or the Calabar School? Okay, now an easy way to answer this would be, there's no easy way, but perhaps an easy way, so to speak, would be to approach it through what we call the ideological structure of the Calabar School. Okay? Now, this ideological structure has 4 components. The first component is called the working thesis. Okay? And the working thesis of the Calabar School, members of the Calabar School, states that understanding the nature of relationships, and that exist between variables and their unique contexts is key to understanding reality, the problems that confront the universe, and how to address such problems. This is the first component of our ideological structure. So in it, you see that two concepts are very important to us: relationship and context. Okay? And the attempt to bring these two together leads us to the third most important concept in the conversational philosophy, and that is complementarity. Now, the second component of the ideological structure is problem. At that point, members of the Calabar School needed to identify if you are a philosopher and you want to address a problem from your area to the problem for the rest of humanity and what have you, you have to first of all be able to identify what that problem is before you start philosophizing about it. Okay? And so the main problem of the 21st century, be reminded that the Calabar School began in the last decade of the 20th century. So now they were trying to formulate what would be the problem that they will philosophize about for the 21st century that was about to come. Okay, so for them, for us, the main problem of the 21st century is the problem of the border lines, written as two separate words, border and lines. Okay, it states that our conception of realities as relational opposites implicates a gap that is both unbridgeable and lopsided. In other words, we are saying that there's a big problem in the way we conceive reality. Okay, and this problem can be thought of as border lines, drawing lines to create borders everywhere. So when this line is drawn between sexes, we have the problem of sexism. When this line is drawn between genders, we have gender problems. When it is drawn between races, we have racism. When it's drawn between those who have and those who have not, we have classism. When it is drawn between people of diverse religious faiths, we have religious bigotry or credoism. And members of the Calabar School say this is going to be the main problem of the 21st century. Look at what is going on in Israel now, Hamas and Israel. Okay? And then you can pick out a number of these problems there. You can see religion there. You can see class there. You can see ethnicism there. You can see racism there. That is, again, the problem you see between what is going on in between Russia and Ukraine. And different flashpoints of all kinds of violence you see everywhere. A few days ago, someone went on a rampage in the United States of America, shooting people. When you probe deeper, you see different lines, again, manifesting. So Calabar School is right in saying that the problem of the 21st century was going to be a problem of borderlines. Number 3 component of the ideological structure is the challenge. So the challenge is to identify the root cause of this problem of borderlines and provide ideas to address its various manifestations. Innocent Asuzu and Chris Ijoma, in their publications, both agree that the root cause of these intellectually can be traced to Aristotle's metaphysics and logic, that is both bifurcatory and lopsided and dichotomous. Okay? When you talk of reality in Aristotelian ontology, you see accident and essence, with essence being superior to accident. That's lopsidedness. That is polarization of reality. You see males and females in Aristotle's work, with males being superior to females. You see freeborns and slaves, with freeborns being superior to slaves. These are the problems that have led to all kinds of terrible things we've had in our world. In the 19th and 20th century, the Belgians who were in the Congo in Africa murdered over 220 million people. Terrible genocide because of the problem of borderline, that they thought they were superior to these people and they could do whatever they liked. Slavery affected millions of families in Africa. Okay, colonialism exploited the continent and different other places. These are all problems of borderline because some people thought they were superior to others, and so on and so forth. And these can all be traced in the ideas that Aristotle and Plato and the rest of them canonized in Western thought. And the fourth component of this, our ideological structure, is what we call the questions. Now that we have known the problem, now that we have confronted the challenge, what are the questions that will lead our inquiry? And the Calabar School formulated two questions. Number one is, does difference amount to inferiority? Number two, and are opposites irreconcilable? All right, so every theoretical effort that members of the Calabar School have made, from Pantaleon Urebu and his theories in metaphysics, epistemology, and what have you, to Innocent Asuzu and Chris Ijoma, Andrew Dugumen and Godfrey Zumba, to the second generation members of the school, like myself and late Mesembe Edet, and to the members of third generation, all efforts have been geared towards addressing this problem of borderlines in their various manifestations, creating theories and ideas to attempt to answer the two lead questions that take us there. So that, in brief, would be what the conversational philosophy is about. It's a philosophy that attempts and methodologically attempts to study relationships between variables, the context of those relationships, and the possibilities of those relationships. Thank you.
And it's interesting that in Ezumezu, you also mentioned the importance of de-hierarchizing different thoughts and different epistemologies in a sort of anarchist, pluralist view of philosophy. In brief, could you say that conversational philosophy would draw some relations with that sort of anarchist way to view plurality in philosophy?
Okay, so yes, that is yes, no as well. It is no if one takes, assumes by anarchy that what is intended is absolute lawlessness or a form of lawlessness in its literal sense. Okay, it is yes if by anarchy one assumes that what is meant is the proliferation of methods. Okay, and that is what I mean when I use the word anarchy. Proliferation of methods, okay, that becomes anarchical in the sense that modernity that structures, Western modernity that structures intellectual progress is one that hinges on a certain standard, laid out standard that must kowtow and abide by the three traditional laws of thought. Okay, anything outside of this standard would be lawless, would be anarchical. And Ezumezu brings in three additional laws that transcends those traditional laws. And to that extent, it becomes anarchical, but more so in the sense of rebellion, intellectual rebellion. Thank you.
Directing to another question, perhaps a little bit lateral, I was thinking, meditating on the importance of works like Ezumezu for us Afro-Brazilian scholars and people who are interested in African philosophy in Brazil or in other countries of Latin America and other places of the world. I personally see a tendency within African studies in general to focus the efforts of research to maybe perhaps ancient Egypt or Kemet or a specific part of the African continent, and thus creating some form of homogenization of what African philosophy could be. And in that sense, I was thinking of how important it is for us, especially Brazilian scholars interested in African philosophy, to think about philosophy produced in a Bantu ground, let's just say, or perhaps in different communities from those often studied in the United States, for example. So I was wondering if Ezumezu has a way of helping us to think of how to combat this uh, homogenization of African thought, of African philosophy, and if Ezumezu helps us to start talking about African philosophies instead of African philosophy in singular.
Okay, thank you very much. This question of homogenization of African philosophy, or even an accusation, has been thrown around in the literature, and is being thrown around. It's as if the more grounds African philosophy gains, the more progress it makes, the more often people throw in this question of homogeneity. Okay? No one is interested, no one is trying to suppress various epistemologies in Africa. Okay? When we talk of African philosophy, we are trying to qualify a field that best represents what many cultural worldviews in Africa subscribe to. Okay? And it is not strange, neither is it an isolated approach. That is also what happens everywhere. Save for the fact that people have accepted the false orthodoxy of Western philosophy as a contextual, it would not be difficult to realize that Western philosophy, again, is the best qualities of different heterogeneous groups in the West. The West itself is not homogeneous. There are different multiplicities of cultures, and with it, multiplicities of philosophical thoughts. Okay? But what happens is Western philosophy becomes an attempt to unite what could be most representative of these aggregating cultures. And that is also what happens in Africa. Ezumezu logic also was developed by aggregating what is most common in the cultures in Africa south of the Sahara, mostly. Okay? And that is what you see when we talk about the three basic principles that I highlighted earlier. The principle of relationality, principle of contextuality, and principle of complementarity. In different African worldviews, you see people believe and hold seriously on the idea that people and things relate in a fundamental way. Amongst the Shona of Zimbabwe, they use the concept of Ukama to represent that. Okay? Ubuntu for people in southern and central and Eastern Africa, use the concept of Ubuntu to represent that. In West Africa, you will see concepts like Komuna and the rest of them. Okay? These are cultures that share a lot in common, even though they are also different in subtle ways. But we are in creating a philosophy that is representative of these cultures. We take the best ideas that they share in common to create that. And that was also how Ezumezu logic, as a trivalent logic, was created. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chimakonam. I'd like to ask you a final question. I'd like you actually to leave a message for young researchers interested in African philosophy, in studying African thought, in Latin America, in all parts of the world. I would like you to leave a message of encouragement, perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much. Contrary to what people and what school children and students read in history books everywhere in the world, of Africa being one desolate continent, being one remote continent, being unconnected to other continents, it's important that people know their history. It's important for them to know that humanity originated from the African continent. It was in African continent, that the first humans lived, from where they migrated and found their ways to other continents and sprout there. Okay, so Africa is the mother continent. Africa is also home to some of the most wonderful topographies and landscapes and vegetations and environments, that resources you can think about. Africa was also, and this is very important, a land of upright human beings prior to the European incursion in the 16th century. When the Europeans arrived, they met Africa that was truthful, honest, hospitable, but the Europeans that arrived were eminently corrupt people, and some of them derelicts from their societies and criminals and crooks. And they decided to take advantage of the uprightness of human beings they found on the continent. Okay? And that led to waves and waves of exploitations, and then suppressions, and then enslavement, and all kinds of terrible things that's been ongoing on to this day. So it's important, if anyone, and young people most importantly, to begin to unlearn the rubbish that they have learned, the terrible things that racists wrote on covers of books that are still being used to teach them to this day. It is important that they make a decision to unlearn some of these terrible indoctrinations and free themselves from such lies. I was watching a documentary where full-grown adults in the United States were asked to describe Africa, and they said Africa is a jungle where people lived in trees and all that. It's so eminently ignorant people. Okay, it's important that they also learn the true Africa and come to Africa and see that Africa is a very wonderful place. And people don't live in trees in Africa, as the case may be. And what is as a final word, what is what some of the important virtues that an intellectual, a scholar, or even a reasonable human being should have? It is the virtue to investigate and not to accept whatever that is shoved down one's throat. It is the virtue to look and search, to seek, to dig deeper, to uncover the real truth about anything whatsoever. And I encourage young people to emulate this, whether they are scholars or not, whether they want to be scholars eventually or not. This is the virtue that a reasonable human being should have. And thank you very much. And I hope that you enjoy the talk and you are inspired to find the truths for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was heavily inspired. I'd like to thank you once again for providing us with this interview. I'd like to thank all our listeners for coming with us in this journey through Ezumezu, through the work of Dr. Chimakonam. E para aqueles que gostariam de ouvir a entrevista, ler a entrevista transcrita em português, vocês podem fazê-lo no site do PET. O link para a transcrição da entrevista está disponível também para nós. Thank you so much once again, and I think that's it.
Thank you too. Thank you too, and enjoy the rest of